This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest is back after a delay of many, many months. He was a favorite of mine. I'm totally at fault for letting him fall off my radar. But he's a journalist. He's knowledgeable. He does his research. And anyway, tonight he's back. Don Debar from Westchester County, New York. Don, welcome back.
Thanks, Regis. It's nice to see you.
I am not going to let this happen again. There is so much going on that I not only want, but I need your insight and your opinion on so many issues. So tonight, let's start with what really has been captivating the attention of the entire world. The Israeli genocide in Palestine. I want to start with the ICJ ruling against Israel from a couple of weeks ago. What were your thoughts on that ruling, Don?
Well, it happens in the context of understanding what the ICJ is and what it can do. And then once it does what it does, which is to render opinions or issue judgments or orders, that what happens in the real world after that. The reality of it is that the International Court of Justice, which is the world court, in essence, it's a creature of the UN Charter, can deal with disputes and controversies between nation states, and then render opinions, advisory opinions, issue orders or judgments. And then whatever the court says should happen, someone has to actually make happen. And the court does not have the authority to issue executions, basically, of its judgments through the Security Council or on its own. In other words, the court cannot send in a military force to enforce its will, unlike a court that could send in the sheriff in a national or regional dispute. Instead, any decision that implies some sort of military action would be referred back to the Security Council, and it would be, an action for the Security Council to take. There's a sort of a fool's loop in there, in that controversies that are, obviously, facially around violations of law, UN Charter, and all good common sense, like the genocide or the mass killing, if you don't like the word genocide, going on by Israel of civilians in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine. The Security Council should have taken that up before anyone ever had to file a paper with the World Court in the first place. It's not necessary to have an adjudication of whether or not, dozens of planes are dropping hundreds of bombs on millions of civilians every day and have been since October 7th. There's photographic evidence of that all across the social media. Everyone in the world literally knows that it's going on. The Security Council could take notice of this on its own, even if it didn't have it brought several times by various members of the council, and then to be vetoed by the United States. The paralysis at the Security Council is entirely the doing of the people making policy in Washington, and that resulted in this case going to the World Court. The World Court came out with a somewhat attenuated acknowledgement of what's going on there. Its order was not for Israel to stop committing genocide, but rather instructing Israel not to commit genocide. And another part of its order was instructing Israel to enable the passage of relief materials to the people of Gaza, after reciting in considerable detail the need for this. The response from Israel was, we're not going to do a damn thing that they tell us. And the response from the United States was to organize a cutoff of funding to the relief agencies that were supposed to have access, and Israel was supposed to allow to deliver the aid. So what I thought of when the decision came out is, well, gee, that's nice. There's some good PR value there. I'm sure the next group of people who get bombed to smithereens or starve to death in Gaza will appreciate their PR victory.
Yeah. But would you agree, Don, that ICJ ruling emboldened millions of people around the world? Because what we're seeing everywhere is massive protests against Israel, including in small towns in my home state of Maine. People everywhere they're talking about boycotting Israel. I think, well, I just want your thoughts on that. Do you think that that ruling at least has emboldened the world?
The obvious evidence is that it emboldened Israel and Washington. The actual material impacts. I'm glad to see people around the world, standing up, shaking the dust off, and getting out in the streets and making demands. I'm very glad to see that. I also, have some sense of the history of that. I remember doing that in 2003 around the pending invasion of Iraq on February 15th and March 20th, which were the two largest, global actions in the history of the world. And on March 22nd or whatever it was, George Bush gave us and the Iraqi people shock and awe, and then proceeded to start a war that lasted another dozen years, took maybe another million people, made homeless maybe another 5 or 10 million people, destroyed the country's infrastructure, and lit the region on fire. We have to do these things that are being done, but they are clearly insufficient to solve the problem, because the problem is still right in front of us. Excuse me. We stopped, perhaps with all of that outcry against the war in Iraq. Perhaps we delayed the war on Libya and Syria by 10 years, or 8 years, and perhaps we delayed the war on Iran until this moment, if that's when that finally breaks. But right now we have a war with Russia, and we have a war with Gaza, and we're engaged in essence in a war with Yemen, which has been going on for 8 years or so now. We've got an occupation of Bahrain by the Saudis. It's been on since 2011, I think. We have a war with Lebanon and Syria that's shaping up between Israel and the United States. And we have a lot worse, on the menu, including, if you go look at just the situation in Ukraine. At the very beginning of this, some people cautioned that, you're now engaging in direct military action, whether by proxy or not, with another nuclear power. What is the nuclear doctrine for that nuclear power, by the way? Some people actually asked this question and looked. What is Russia's nuclear doctrine? We will use nuclear weapons only in 2 cases. One, in a retaliatory strike against the nuclear attack against our country, or 2, when the survival of the Russian state is placed in jeopardy by military action. So the response here by the maniacs in the Pentagon or Langley or whoever the hell's making policy, maybe some drunk behind the White House, I don't know, was to try a drone strike on the Kremlin, and the military attack on Crimea. They tried two full on rocket attacks, significant ones on there. What did we accomplish exactly? I mean, did we postpone it? In other words, these tools that we are using right now are not up to the task that's before us. The task before us, first of all, is to prevent the destruction of human society by a massive military action that's the result of either conscious policy decisions or missteps that followed from insane policy decisions. Whether it's the guns of August or Armageddon, doesn't really matter when the dust settles, the radioactive dust settles. And so what are we going to do to cope with this? Because it's underway.
I'm glad you brought that up. Boy, it's the first time I've heard anybody say that, in fact, the ICJ judgment emboldened Israel and the United States. Because as a matter of fact, they flipped the finger at the rest of the world. They flipped the finger at the ICJ, with America now and the UK bombing the heck out of Yemen, trying to destroy the Houthis, who have disrupted traffic going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And then I'm glad that you transitioned to the war in Ukraine, because that's going on right next door to where I live here in Yalta, in the Crimea. Yeah. So far, we have not been struck, but the bridge at Kerch has been hit 2 times. Yeah. There have been multiple drone attacks and missile attacks, apparently, on ships in the Black Sea, the port at Sevastopol. You mentioned that absolutely freaking insane drone attack on the Kremlin last year. Yeah. Here's my question, Don. Putin, and it's not just Putin. He is not Joseph Stalin,
right? That's
by
right.
any stretch. He has a circle of advisors around him. He has a military. Correct. How do you interpret the patience that Russia has shown in not being provoked when attacks against Russia and the Russian people have taken place with somewhat regularity? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I interpret it as sanity, in essence. Patience, a long view, a maturity. So in October 1962, we have what they call in the United States the Cuban Missile Crisis, when, following the installation of NATO, quote unquote, U.S. missiles in Turkey, which was near the Soviet border, that the Soviet Union installed some nuclear missiles inside Cuba. And the United States demanded that the missiles be removed, and came very close to having nuclear war by all accounts. Robert McNamara, who was a Secretary of Defense, has spoken and written extensively about his recollections, and the record has been exposed from much transcripts of conversations and whatnot. The thing itself was fairly public at the time. The memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary and the prime minister of the USSR at the time, Fidel Castro, in a number of interviews, including at a press conference with Robert McNamara back in 1990. Everyone agrees, first of all, that we were this close. This is the way McNamara described it in Fog of War, to a nuclear war, and that the only reason we didn't have one was, in McNamara's words, dumb luck, which are essentially the same words that Robert Kennedy used in his book, 13 Days, and that Khrushchev used in his memoirs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The lesson that Robert F. Kennedy Sr. drew, according to what was written in his memoir, which was assembled by Ted Sorensen, so maybe a combination of the two, that he ascribes, that Robert Kennedy ascribes to the lesson he and his brother, the president, John Kennedy, learned, that they articulated, was that never put another nuclear power in a position where they have to suffer a humiliating defeat or use their nuclear weapons. That is that's the route to nuclear war, basically. It's not to be done. And so you have the enunciation, in the media by the president of the Russian Federation, President Putin, that this is our nuclear doctrine, just so people, can stop being nervous that I'm sitting here with my finger on the button waiting to blow you guys up. I'm only going to use we're not going to use them. We'd only use them if you used them against us first, or if you tried to, destroy our state. And so the response from the people here was to try to decapitate the state with a strike on the Kremlin. You have to ask yourself how that policy holds up against the lessons of the missiles of October. And then you have to ask yourself, who's making this policy? And see, this is one of the things I've been kicking around with some of the other, gray-haired colleagues that I have, who've been around and saw. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, as they called it, and I've studied it, in the 60 years or whatever since. I guess it's 62 years since then. And asking myself, who would be crazy enough to invite, let alone tempt, to invite a nuclear exchange? And what could possibly put anyone in a position where they were required to do that? I mean, it's not like it's written into our DNA that we have to have a war with Russia. The U.S. economy doesn't require it, certainly. We have plenty of food and every damn thing we want. We stole, the whole continent from the people that lived here and have been living off the fatted calf ever since. We don't need a damn thing that they have in Russia. And Russia doesn't need a damn thing that we have. They have more land than anybody else on the planet. And so there's no compelling need for a war or conquest. So even if there were, you'd have to ask yourself, well, do I live like not so high on the hog and not have a nuclear war? Or do I go for it and maybe I'll be able to live high on the hog, but maybe I'll have a nuclear war? I mean, it's not even that. And yet these people are inviting it. So you have to ask yourself how and why, and try to get into the minds of the people that are doing it. This is something that McNamara talks about in Fog of War and elsewhere, about having empathy for your adversary. And I would say that at the moment, humanity has to look at the people making policy here as their adversary, because this is where the risk of nuclear war rests. And nuclear war is an adversary of every living thing on this planet. Maybe not cockroaches. As they say, they'll still inherit the planet. And what could motivate these people? Looking at this with empathy for what's going on in my mind that brings me to this conclusion. And the only thing that I can think of, I mean, outside of just, sheer psychosis, and this may well be a kind of psychosis, it's a new one in our new age, is that, and we were socialized in a way, even a generation or two after me. I'm 70 years old today, as a matter of fact. And, I learned that consequences happen in the real world to the things you do in the real world. You make fun of some other kid and he smacks you in the head and you feel the pain, and it's swelling for a day or two or three. It doesn't just go away. There's no reset button. Everything that we do there's a consequence to it. Whether you move a bottle, the bottle stays moved. All of these things happen in the physical world, and they stay happened. These people are socialized. The last maybe 2 generations have been socialized on video games. And at the end of the video game, which has high stimulation, emotional interaction, the visual and auditory and every other damn thing, and you get all driven to do it, and you act and all the, and then it's over, and it's a reset. Nothing happened. Nothing changed in the world at all. And I think there may be a visceral connection to reality missing in these people that are making policy that before required a psychotic break, and now is just, lack of a better word, poor socialization. I don't know what it is.
Well, a lot of us have thought about this, and I shaved my gray hair. And by the way, happy birthday.
Thank you.
Did you say 70 or 72?
70. Yeah.
70.
Yep.
Wow. Well, I'm coming up on a birthday this month. It'll be 78 trips around the sun. Yeah.
Man.
And I feel like I'm 40.
Yeah, I feel like I'm about 160 today, but I had to help a friend of mine out this morning. So
yeah, let's get back on the topic here. We're talking about, and I call it insanity.
Yeah.
And maybe evil in the minds of those people who are creating this crisis, holding the entire world in nuclear hostage. I made my second documentary film, was entitled 30 Seconds to Midnight. And at that time, the Bureau of Atomic Scientists had the doomsday clock at 3.5 minutes. And I said, no, they don't want to scare people. We are this close. And that was in 2016.
Yep.
And I said at the end of the film, will these neocons, now I would say whatever you want to call them, global elite, financiers, global finance, whatever, recognizing they have lost this epic battle for control of the future order of the world. That's what it is,
right.
I believe. Take the whole world down with them in a nuclear Armageddon.
Right.
Don, I'm not ready to go yet, and I don't want to go in a pile of nuclear ash.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, these people right now are conducting the largest military exercises, war games against Russia, all around Russia's borders right now.
I know.
The largest ever.
Yeah.
90,000 NATO troops, American kids, traipsing through Germany, through Poland, through Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. When you look at this situation from the perspective of Russia, given everything we've been talking about, I mean, ever since Truman had him drop the bomb on Japan, it was not the end of war. It was a signal to Stalin. Ever since that time, the Soviet Union and then Russia has been the enemy, the boogeyman. Don, with this exercise that's going on right now that'll continue until May, the danger of a miscalculation, a misjudgment, some erroneous data could lead Russia to believe that they are being attacked. If you're sitting in Putin's shoes or in Shoigu's shoes or anybody that's in control in Russia, they know that it's less than 5 minutes before all hell could be unleashed on Russia. This is insanity. But what are your thoughts on this, which is the most latest provocation on Russia?
Well, I would say, first of all, keep an eye on Kazakhstan and Belarus. Um, if you look at a map of the current situation and the attempted provocation apparently through Georgia the last day or two, also, you look at a map of the present, situation of forces, and now with those, being put in motion, all that military material being put in motion, and then look at a map of the fullest expression of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion in 1941 of the Soviet Union. You'll see that, with the exception of Kazakhstan and Belarus, that the enemy has already captured all of the territory, and they've done a lot of it without firing any real shots to do it. They have secured the 3 Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, at least half or 2/3 of Ukraine, Armenia and or Azerbaijan. They're certainly not integral parts of the Russian, defense or military. Georgia, with the contradictions that exist with Georgia. Now Kazakhstan, they went from Kazakhstan and Belarus both in, was it 2022 or 2021? I don't remember. They tried the color revolutions in both that were turned back. But again, they form a new government in Kazakhstan, I think today or yesterday. There could be some mobilization of the third, fifth column in either or both of those countries while these troops are nearby. And from this side of the mediascape, it'll be presented as a democratic uprising that Russia is trying to stomp with a provisional government that invites NATO to come defend them or something. You might have one of those scenarios play out in the middle of all of this. Certainly, it creates another area of instability and of uncertainty. People don't understand when you have a what do you call it? In a war games, that you in essence have an invasion that stops at the border. The enemy mobilizes their troops and they make a dash for your border. It looks just like an invasion, if only it stops. And you really don't know if it's going to stop or not until it does, or it doesn't. And when they're mobilized for 4 months or 4.5 months, whatever this drill is going to be, I forget the name of it. First of all, it's really an occupation of all of the border states with the military at this point. It's a nice fiction that, the democratic forces, the same ones that welcomed the Nazis, by the way, in the Baltics and in Ukraine and here and there, all threw off the Russian oppressors, finally, with the beneficent assistance of the United States. And now they're free, democratic, happy places where everybody has a unicorn and a rainbow in their window. Until there's an actual military force, NATO, running the streets of the place. And then you realize the true nature of what this is. And what you're looking at really at this moment is military occupation of all of the land that was taken by Hitler, with the exception of Belarus and parts of Kazakhstan. And I think about as much of Ukraine as Hitler was able to grab. It's a little fuzzy in my mind there. And that's before they start loading their material. They brought all their toys up to the border now. They're all the switches are all going on. And so you're sitting in Russia waiting for something to come across the border to know whether or not that's the first volley and the first attack, or if somebody, blew off a firecracker and it was some kind of mistake. The return fire, in any event, no matter what it is, no matter how measured it is, will be presented as if it were an attack initiative by Russia on the peace-loving, rehearsing NATO forces, which is a very dangerous moment.
I'm thinking back to what you were talking about during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You and I both remember that, October.
Yeah.
And the difference between now and then is that Kennedy and Khrushchev at least could talk to each other. But right now, Putin has nobody to talk to. I mean, when I look at who's doing the talking in the United States right now, Joe Biden doesn't even know where the bathroom is,
I know.
what day it is. On one day, you have Blinken talking. The other day, you have Sullivan talking. Another day, you've got somebody else doing the talking. And then you have Victoria in Ukraine doing the talking. It's like, who can Putin talk to that can make a difference?
Yeah. I know that's a problem, and there are others too. One of the other things that McNamara said, well, in Bobby Kennedy's book, again, 13 Days, that he just talks about, he relates a conversation with Jack Kennedy. They had like something they called executive committee, XCOM or something, that was managing this crisis, this issue. And they had experience already with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with the military, wanting a war with Russia. They were convinced that their relative position militarily vis-a-vis Russia was at its peak, and that it could only deteriorate from there. So they saw war as inevitable. And so they were like, look, we're going to get in a nuclear war. That's the way it is. They really don't have that many nukes, and so we can tough it out, but we'll win that. And that was their thinking. And they had already misled him about, in terms of military intelligence, about the likely outcome of the invasion that the U.S. had tried a year earlier at the Bay of Pigs and Playa de Giron in Cuba. And so, having been burned once, and then seeing that these guys and the Joint Chiefs actively wanted a war, and they were angry when Kennedy was able to avoid one, because they felt that that was some kind of a betrayal. That to understand that this is a mindset that does exist, and it exists at the highest levels of power, including at the military. Now, at that time, there was an actual contradiction, a tension between the civilians, the president and the defense secretary and, Secretary of State, etc., on one side, and the military, the Joint Chiefs on the other. It's supposed to be under our system, civilian control of the military at all times. Even in a state of martial law, the president, the elected civilian official, is the primary official. And that is the condition that existed in 1962 and probably up until November 22nd, 1963, that ended up producing the output that we got, which was no war with Russia, no nuclear war. It would have been a nuclear war. And there were some accidents that I don't want to get into, but that could have very easily led to that, So you have that condition then. Any sane person knows that Joe Biden is a product of the intelligence and military here. He's an appointee by the intel, basically. He's like Langley's meat puppet. And you can see how frayed the strings are. I mean, every day there's some other, evidence of his degenerative condition, mental condition, psychiatric condition, geriatric condition, whatever. And so we don't have that cover. Now, that's one aspect, that you point out correctly, not only did we not have somebody for the other side to negotiate with because he's not in charge, we don't have civilian control of the military or intelligence agencies anymore. We rather have their, appointee in the seat, and he's incompetent to do anything really. So he's not even in a position to push back. The thing that they discussed in this book that I started out to tell you is a book that was written in the early 1960s by a history professor named Barbara Tuchman, Tuchman, called The Guns of August. And it has to do with World War I, the First World War, and the conditions around it that she proposes led to it, out of the historical record. And in Kennedy's book, Bobby Kennedy's book, where he details a conversation that he and Jack Kennedy had with also Ken O'Donnell, who was his right-hand person, president's aide, whatever you call him, about this book. And he said it's about the First World War, and all of these countries thought they understood what the other ones would do in response to their individual actions, that they could understand what would happen next every time they did something. But the lessons were all from the last war, and they had nothing to do with the present moment. And so as they moved, they kept digging themselves further and further into a situation where they ended up having the bloodiest war in history that none of them wanted. And what we're looking at now, they say history repeats itself twice. First is tragedy, then farce. I think we went right to farce on this one. And I guess maybe World War II was the tragedy, because we don't have anyone on top to, attenuate the worst instincts of whatever this Megillah is that's, in motion right now. And the players themselves are not in a position to self-regulate, because they obviously believe that they're going to be able to take control of the world, and that no one is going to stop them, and that no one will use these weapons, that only they have the threat of pulling the temple down on themselves at the end, and that no one else will do that. And so they're provoking. I mean, I want to repeat this. Putin says to the world, look, we're not going to use our nuclear weapons. The only time we'd use them is either if you were crazy enough to use them against us, or if you were crazy enough to try to dismantle our state. And if you do that, we're going to use them, though. And the response to that was a hit on the damn Kremlin. And how much crazier could they possibly be? And so you don't have what they called in 1962 cooler heads. There's no cooler heads to prevail, because the heads that are in control are clearly insane, whether it's clinically true or sociologically true. In this situation where they are trying to induce nuclear war, the word insane is the most accurate description of it that I can come up with. I mean, if you want to call a linguist or something to see if they've got some other better substance.
I call it evil. It's insane, but I believe that it's evil. When you have people who are driven to bring all of life on the planet to the very brink of destruction, that can only be called evil. I almost don't want to ask you the next question, but I have to.
Okay.
And Don, I have to promise you, I value your insight, your historical knowledge so much that I got to have you back on a regular basis. I promise you that.
Okay.
But I want to finish on this, Don, because I think this is big news in what we're talking about. There's been a battle in the United States Congress not to give any more financial aid to Ukraine until the border issue is taken care of. So the funds for right now have dried up. the European Union has just agreed to send Ukraine, I think it's over 5 years, a billion or so dollars a year. That's nothing. That doesn't even pay the expenses of their bureaucracy, their government, their local officials. And now what we're reading in the news, to me, is really terrifying. Zelensky, under extreme pressure, has been fighting with his top general, Zaluzhny.
Yeah.
Going to fire him, not going to fire him, going to wait. Today, the news is that Zelensky and the top military brass, including top aides around Zelensky, are going to be fired. And you and I have got to both know that Zelensky has not been in charge since the first day that he became the president.
He's an actor.
What has got me really worried is it isn't just Zelensky and his top aides. Vitaly Klitschko, the former heavyweight champion, boxing champion of the world, the mayor of Kiev, said, and he said this several times, but just recently, that Zelensky is jeopardizing Ukraine's interests. Don, in light of what we've been talking about, there are no sane people, no one person in Washington Putin could talk to. Putin and Shoigu and his advisors are looking at this, unbelievable chaos in Ukraine with who's going to run that country. It is such a dangerous time. Yeah. What are your thoughts on what's going on and what's behind it in Ukraine right now?
Well, all right. So Zelensky is an actor. He's a puppet. He played president. He auditioned by auditioning on television for the job, and then he was appointed to the job. The elections, for anyone who has any illusions about it, the elections in Ukraine have been cooked ever since the coup in 2014. I'm not going to bother going into it now. If you have a doubt about it, send me a note or something, and I'll detail it for you. He's a puppet of a particular set of interests there, both foreign and domestic. The foreign ones, are Langley and Washington, D.C., I guess. And his job was, in essence, to hold back rapprochement of the population that might have developed naturally after the coup and after the first couple of years of fighting under Poroshenko. And had to try to hold the country together and to try to do as much damage to Russia as possible. That's not his job, that part. That's the people that are running the military operation. There are military people like Zaluzhny and others that are, Ukrainian. It's interesting also, though, that this country that has in power a ultra-nationalist movement and Nazis, it's as nationalist as they come, has, at the pinnacle of power, some foreigners, like we had, what's his name, from Georgia, for example, Saakashvili, and others. In the military, the indigenous Ukrainian military officers around Zaluzhny are also on the chopping block, as you mentioned. And you have to understand, first of all, that they're the ones, when the Americans are giving them military strategy or telling them how to conduct the war, they're the ones that understand what the consequence of each of these things, will be. They have military training. Zelensky is an actor. He plays piano with Volodymyr Jr. or whatever, and plays president. Puts on presidential clothes and dances to "Hail to the Chief" in Ukrainian, whatever the version is, and collects a payment in scale after each episode. But he's not a military strategist or a military planner, even though the office probably carries the title of commander in chief. And so, if there's a disagreement between Zelensky and Zelensky on military strategy, you have to ask yourself, what are the possible areas of disagreement? I mean, at the boundaries, it would be to stop fighting the war and recognize that there's no value to continue fighting the war, or to prosecute it even more fully in some insane delusion that somehow you're going to beat Russia and kick them out of the country and everything's going to be, happy glory after that. I think what's happening instead is that they're clearing out the actual Ukrainian military leadership, because they're going to have the Ukrainian military do something that will be so destructive to Ukraine and or the Ukrainian military that Zelensky doesn't have the stomach for it. I think that's where we are. And so I think what's happening is because they've gotten, they're beaten by a major power, which Ukraine, for all the rhetoric, is not. It's like France against the United States. So they and without nuclear weapons, by the way. So it seems that, having put themselves in the position that they're in, and where Russia's now poised to make some major advances into Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine's pretty much exhausted its potential militarily, that the end game envisioned by one group is to try to make reasonable peace and keep everything intact, and maybe find some modus vivendi going forward with Russia and NATO and whatever. And that would be, if I were the head of the Ukrainian military, what I would be counseling, because I would understand the picture from where I sit, and I would want to keep my forces intact, and I would want to do my primary job, which is defend my country from being destroyed. When you have an actor who's reading off of a script written by somebody else, you're not bound by any of that stuff. And so, since Zelensky's office empowers him to fire the generals, and all one needs to do is to get control of his buttons, and you can do anything you want, which, again, American policy there is to conduct a war against Russia to try to induce a regime change or a collapse of the nation state. The goal of the United States has been articulated, towards Russia, which is to decolonize it, quote unquote. That's the word they use. The claim being that Russia is not an actual nation, but rather an empire that was assembled out of 12 or 15 nations, depending on which color blotter acid the person lecturing happened to take, beforehand, and that it needs to be, broken up into its constituent nation states. So you have these little nationlets that will be there. It'll look sort of like Europe does, and the rest of Europe does, and it'll be largely unpopulated. I mean, the population of Russia is somewhere around 150 million right now, and the largest landmass, on the planet. And so, if you split some of that up into 12 pieces, 15 pieces, there's going to be a lot of empty land just waiting for ExxonMobil or, whoever to roll in there and start carrying stuff away. And that's the plan articulated by a number of segments of the State Department under the Helsinki Group, and it includes on the executive committee the guy representing my district in Congress, Mike Lawler. Knowing that is the position of the U.S., looking at what's going on with the leadership in Ukraine, seeing the movement of troops in the area and the excitement of opposition already in Kazakhstan and Georgia, and an attempted incident in Georgia, it's a pretty scary moment.
You've connected the dots. I'm just wondering what's going to happen, whether Zelensky is going to be successful in firing Zelensky, or Zelensky and his military will exercise a military coup and get rid of Zelensky.
You know, can I interrupt you for a minute? Because something
Yeah.
occurred to me. When you have an actor as the face of the government, I'm thinking about this movie called Simone that Robert De Niro made with a virtual actor. Nobody knew she was a computer manufacturer. When you have an actor as the face of the government, if you're going to have a coup, it doesn't necessarily involve the actor. In other words, Zelensky could send his boys over to see whoever it is that's pulling Zelensky's strings and take the strings. That's one way of affecting a coup. And now Zelensky says, it was all a joke. I love my pal Zelensky. And goes back to playing his piano or whatever.
I want to end on this note. What's that?
That note, the note Zelensky played?
No, this note that I'm going to mention right now. Zelensky has put it into that nobody can talk with Russia about peace negotiations or anything.
Right.
That's off the table. But there are bloggers and part of the mainstream media that are speculating that Putin is ready to negotiate. My point has been, since February of 2022, when Putin announced the special military operation, there were 3 goals. 3. Number 1 was to demilitarize Ukraine. A lot of people were thinking, well, that's just demilitarizing the Ukrainian army. Russia and Putin knew that the United States, Ukraine, France, Canada, and others were all in there and involved. So to denazify, to demilitarize Ukraine is to cleanse it of all of that Western influence. Number 2 goal, denazify. You talked about the Nazi regime that really was running Ukraine out of Kiev. That's a political process. After they defeat all of those battalions, there aren't too many left, the Azov battalion, what's left of it, and just destroy them. It's a political process to change some 75 years, 75 years of neo-Nazi indoctrination. And the third goal is to guarantee a constitutionally neutral Ukraine, which means all of those neo-Nazis who are in the government today have got to be cleaned out, and a new constitution has got to be written. Don, I don't think Russia and Putin is up to negotiating any of that. I think they will determine the terms of complete surrender, as MacArthur did in Tokyo Bay with the Japanese at the end of World War II. What are your thoughts?
That's it. Yeah, the term is unconditional surrender, right? Excuse me, I got a little tickle in my throat. It has to come to an end, unless this is going to be the avenue to world war. It's difficult to see whether or not this is some kind of an elaborate bluff by the West, or because I think that there are some in leadership circles in the West that believe that they can recreate 1991, and that Russia, leading circles inside Russia's political economy, political establishments, military intelligence, um, will say, you know what? If we just completely surrender and buy into their system and trade them into our system or whatever, it might be a little rough, but in the long run, everybody will be better off. And so why don't we just do that? Because we're looking down the barrel of a gun otherwise, and let's be the sane ones. I don't think, first of all, that's the real scenario. I think that what's planned for, no matter what they're promising anybody in leadership in Russia, the plan is to loot the place like they were in the process of doing when Yeltsin was president. But even more than that, I think that it's not possible to do that, even if they convince the leadership to do it, because the Russian people themselves remember the 1990s, and they ain't going back there. And so this whole thing I'm talking about right now is a small slice of the reality. But for those people in the U.S. government who believe, A, 1991 was exactly what your BS says it was, and B, you can recreate 1991 now. For those people, it's not possible. The Russian people will not allow it to happen. And I think that the Russian leadership is too aware to agree with the fantasy that this would somehow, be an acceptable outcome for the country. So the question is going to be, is there going to be a point in time when the government and decision makers here accept the reality that they don't run the entire world and they're never gonna? Or are they going to push to a point where we end up with a devastating war, nuclear or otherwise? And, we can either be observers of that process or active participants. And if we're going to be active participants, we have to come up with a technology and methodology that allows us and empowers us to be players. And we got to do it pretty goddamn fast because time is very short.